Welcome back. You're watching HFO-TV. HFO-TV is co-sponsored by the construction, repair, and restoration firm J.R. Johnson, the real estate law firm Baljanik LLP, the tax deferral accommodator Butler Exchange Group, the mortgage banking firm Gantry Incorporated, and forensic building consultants providing building structural science services.
Welcome back to HFO TV. I'm Greg Frick, partner at HFO Investment Real Estate. And today we have with us Michael Havlik, Deputy Executive Director of Multifamily Northwest. It's been an organization that we've been involved with for years. It's the largest, I think, multifamily owner and management organization in the state of Oregon.
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
So thanks for coming and talk. It's been a very busy last 5 years politically and some other things. So we'll jump into quite a few topics. And you just told me you just got back from a 15-day trip on the Pacific Crest Trail, so glad you made it back. And I'm sure that was very fun to kind of disconnect for a while, but now you're back in the throes of it. So, Yes.
Greg, thank you for having me. Yeah, we did. We packed about 185 miles through the Pacific Crest Trail, and just the travel through Oregon was unbelievably beautiful. It was pristine and just gorgeous. So every day was another vista that we couldn't believe. So
I'm sure it reminds you of the beauty of Oregon. That's
right.
We still have people moving up here and immigration up here. So
right.
Well, why don't we give a little, for our audience, a little history kind of what's Multifamily Northwest. We've been on here multiple times and talked about the political things, but kind of maybe in the last 6 to 9 months, what's been going on, and then we'll kind of look, where we are today and what's kind of in the short-term horizon in the future.
So, since the beginning of the pandemic, Multifamily Northwest has tried to really be a leader in providing information and context for things that were going on. We've been involved in legislative advocacy to make sure that the bills that were coming through make sense, that they protect both residents and housing providers. And
which is always not easy in the political environment that we're in right now.
Right. I think there were some things that came at us very quickly, gut and stuff bills that kind of caught us by surprise, and we had to mobilize very quickly to really sort things out and understand what the implications would be. And we did our best to guide on what would actually work, and sometimes we were successful, and sometimes we weren't so successful, and things. We've seen some of the outcomes of things that have been, pretty challenging for our multifamily providers.
No, it's been a tough couple. It's been a tough legislative session. This and the last few, just in terms of, I don't want to say the level of, I don't want to say fairness, but where things have gone, and then. It's almost sometimes we're always kind of left with the repercussions and kind of cleaning up on the unintended consequences, be it, inclusionary zoning, being some of these other regulations, be it in city, county, state. So your hands have been full. We know that. So.
Yeah, and I think that housing providers right now are fairly frustrated with what they've done. They've tried to maintain their businesses, keep their doors open, maintain their employees, their payroll. And they've faced some real difficulties in accessing some of the resources that are available to them. I think that they've felt a little bit like lawmakers are somewhat desensitized to the consequences for them, and they don't. They feel that there's the potential to have a generational impact on the supply of certain types of housing that really isn't being apprehended right now. So those are things that we're very interested in, which is understanding how much supply is being lost, maybe what's been forgone, where perhaps a developer chooses a different state to go to, and what we're going to do about supply and affordability, which is a tremendous concern for us.
Yeah, it almost seems there's a disconnect a little bit between the causes of lack of supply when you have the same amount or increased demand. What that does on the imbalance. I mean, we just had somebody here talking about the lumber prices and why they've gone up. It's the kind of the same thing in housing. Affordability is an issue, we know that, but if we're going to have restrictions on supply and make it tougher to bring product, and then demand is not curbed at all. It's not like we're putting up a border and saying you can't come into Oregon. You're going to have price appreciation, and how do you address that? And right now, it just feels that a lot of it's being put onto the property owners and the management company soldiers to deal with that. Even in the pandemic when we had, the CDC with the moratorium and things like that, we understand that. But how do we address the people that are providing services? So.
Greg, at the outset of the pandemic, back in March of 2020, we started to research what rental assistance would look like. Right. And we sent out a series of emails trying to, is there going to be a single point of entry for tenants to be able to access this? Is there going to be, what kind of reporting? What is the amount and where is it? What's the timing for getting it? How do you give your residents some sort of reassurance that that they're going to qualify, that they can identify where to go to get it, and that to be able to reduce folks, housing insecurity, and we really advocated for there to be better points of entry that were more visible and transparent to the general public so that people could access it more readily. That's really been a problem. There's been a problem in the fragmentation. I'm talking big picture. There's a problem in the fragmentation of that service delivery through our state of Oregon. And, we wanted to encourage the state to create more clarity around that and more less fragmentation, so that people wouldn't have to go 15 different places to try and get help. Yeah. So.
And were they? I know. Were they? Because we talked about there were services available. There were funds either coming federally. The state had dedicated some funds, but like you mentioned, trying to advocate or at least educate on ways to get those funds, to people in need, to property owners, so they can help tenants. Where are we today in regards to that? I mean, now, we've had, Multnomah County's got their own deal, Portland's had their own deal. Maybe give an overview of where we are today and what that looks like.
Well, in terms of rental assistance, the currently available rental assistance is called the Oregon ERAP program. Right. It's the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. Currently, there's about $204 million at the state and around $79 million at several different counties. For example, Multnomah, Washington, Clackamas, Lane, and Marion counties actually got their own allocation
for federal funds.
For federal funding, yeah. So they're managing that in their own manner.
Got it.
And then the state is managing the $204 million that applies to the entire state through a centralized program. It's called the ALITA program, which is was also used for the Landlord Compensation Fund. And so this is a program where tenants can apply directly for rent, utilities, eviction costs, fees, and other costs related to keeping them in their homes. And at high level, it's kind of the right idea. It's an idea that would enable the state to report regularly, to have a better sense of the demand across the state of Oregon, and and also to show people what's left. What are my odds of actually getting this help?
And again, this was a tenant. This is tenant.
This is tenant-based.
Tenant-based. The tenant's going to tenant. Yes.
Yeah. So let me just take a quick step back. Yeah. Back in December, we opened. The state opened the Landlord Compensation Fund, which was $150 million.
Right.
That they would pay out over 3 phases, where they looked at other states that were trying to be more efficient in their distribution of rental assistance and thought, hey, what if a landlord they have 18 people at their property that need rental assistance? What if we allow the landlord to apply, or the housing provider to apply in bulk for all of those residents? And then they could move through the rental assistance quicker. And they'd seen that done in Colorado and a couple of other states, and tried to adopt that model. And that funding, the last round of that funding closed in June, and then funding for that doesn't extend past July. So June 30th would be the last amount of funding that a resident would get on behalf of themselves through the landlord, right?
Okay.
So unfortunately, rounds 2 and rounds 3 are still being processed. Much of it hasn't been paid out. I don't know if the state they had indicated they'll be reporting on it sometime in September. So we don't know exactly where the funding is right now in terms of being paid down, how much of the $150 million had been committed.
And that's been a thing you've brought up before. We've talked, many times, just the lack of transparency of we hear there's money there, it's in the press that we're getting all this money, but on the boots on the ground, it's not getting out. It's not, we've got owners, I've got some that have been paid in 1 and 2, and I've got other ones that still have not been paid in 1, and there's no, and we've got some even within the same management company, one is and one is not, and we're trying to understand, well, how to, is it, you happen to get the right case? Who knows? And it's just the lack of transparency has been tough on your organization, on our organization with owners, on what to say. How do we help a tenant? What do we say to this tenant?
I think we've made extraordinary efforts to try and follow this and try and understand. We've a few of our members at the outset were part of a test group that helped try and debug the program, and they were seeing things at that time that they knew were going to be problematic. We do know, for example, when the program was designed, for example, a landlord would have to enter for all 10 months. They'd have to put a line in for each one of those months for all of their tenants. And if you have 200 units, that's 2,000 lines of information per property. And the original program was designed to only take 1,500 lines of information. So all the 500 lines would get deleted and people tried to enter it again. And what ended up happening was the system got overloaded and bogged down. It was beyond capacity, and there were multiple entries. Folks couldn't see that their information stuck, and
so nobody knew.
So they'd re-enter it, and it was the first round was very, very difficult, and I think caused a lot of heartache for people who were tasked with managing that system. And then through each wave of funding, the rules have changed a little bit. So the second time they changed the rules of the entry, it wasn't one system of processing your information. You were able to do it a little bit easier the next time. And then the third round, they notified housing providers that there would be 100% compensation for
the first two were 80%.
The first two were discounted by 20%. Right. And really, Greg, that was a kind of a tipping point for people. I mean, if you could go to one bank on one side of the street and get paid 100%, and the other one you would get 80%, it really it caused this kind of pause where people weren't sure if they should apply for this, and whether if the tenant went to another pot of money that came out of the same round of funding and they could get 100%. I mean, that would certainly be preferable. So
we had owners on strictly on a fairness thing. We had a lot of owners that we've talked to just didn't feel right going to get assistance for this tenant when the tenant next door has done everything they can to continue to pay. And again, I'm not saying this for all tenants, but there's some bad actors on both sides. But thinking, is that really fair that this person who maybe didn't lose their job, was still getting paid, just decided not to pay rent, as we call them, elective non-payers? They're getting relief, and what do I say to the person next door that's, not only relief, the property owner's taking a 20% discount. Is that really fair? And I think we've had some owners, on top of it was just a pain to even get the stuff in the system anyway. So
yeah, so I think that the changes sort of every month. I think some of the housing providers that had the experience of the first time applying may have shied away from it in the future, maybe felt that wasn't really a workable system. And I know people who are extraordinarily technically savvy who really are continuing to struggle with it right now. So hopefully those funds will get out. The other challenge now is that housing providers who have applied for that money and are scheduled to receive the money but haven't received the money, in some cases their tenants have been notified that they are receiving it. In some cases the tenants haven't been notified that they're receiving it. And at the same time, the tenants are applying for themselves because they don't believe that it's going to arrive. So we're having, in some cases, the potential for two streams of money coming in for the same tenant, and then what to do with that. Again, you've got one. So it's become a very, very complicated tracking issue for housing providers to get that corrected, and then figure out if the tenant's overcompensate, can they take that money and apply it to future periods beyond July 1st. So yes, it's been a lot. It's been an interesting moving target, and hopefully the final for the Landlord Compensation Fund will be wrapped up so that we can really focus on encouraging tenants to advocate for themselves and go through the Oregon ERAP program.
So then let's talk, so, that's the landlord compensation from in terms of, getting it submitted. Now, we're not sure when everybody's going to get paid, but we'll see on that. Let's talk a little bit about we have the CDC, moratorium. We had the state of Oregon extend out the moratorium by 60 days. Then Multnomah County kind of put another layer on top of that. Maybe some of the difficulties and what you see, where we are today in regards to some of those things. So again, we've got owners, am I under this guide? Am I under this one? What do I do? And, maybe shine some light at where we are with that.
I'll make an effort to.
Yes.
I think that, what we maintain in our offices are just matrices of, dates and times and locations and counties and cities. Because there has been a rather scattershot approach to what we're doing in the state of Oregon.
Right.
And if you take really a high level look at what if theoretically we had just accepted the CDC moratorium and used the documentation that the CDC required that we use, I think that we'd be much better situated. Right
because
now.
Our state. There was a CDC moratorium. Mm-hmm. Our state did their own without the documentation. Right. Yeah.
So, and for those who are unaware, Oregon set up a system by which a tenant could provide a declaration to their housing provider that they'd had an increase in expenses or they were unable to pay rent for whatever reason. They didn't have to explain it. And that once they provided that declaration, that the housing provider couldn't pursue that rent until the end of June 30th.
Right.
So, and that was back in January.
Right.
So there wasn't the need to go back and say, what, this month I'm unable to pay or this month I'm unable to pay. And I think that housing providers found that really unworkable when they saw folks returning to work the nice thing about the CDC moratorium is just like every month you would have to go in and pay your rent, but the CDC moratorium and documentation every month you would go in and say, I'm unable to pay rent this month, and here's the documentation. Right. And I think that on its face felt more equitable.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Also what we're seeing is we have seen that the current rounds of so the system for the tenant documenting that they're unable to pay a rent really doesn't make sense on its face, right?
Right.
Also, for the tenant, the challenge of finding rental assistance has been really difficult. I mean,
which I've heard is even harder, and I've talked to owners in other states that seem to do a better job of getting resources to tenants, or at least getting them in the direction.
Sure.
And again, I don't know if it's, again, we've had conversations about Oregon's issue of even getting unemployment out. And then, like you said, tenants finding resources that are there, the inability to do that.
So if you look at the Oregon ERAP program, the $204 million that the state is managing through the community action agencies, the fund opened on May 19th. And it's now July 22nd. They've had 21,320 applications as of today, and they've paid out 550.
And again, this is the one where it's a tenant, where the tenant's applying.
The tenant's applying,
right.
Yes.
So they've had 21,000
applications, and 550 have been paid out as of today. Mm-hmm. And I think we're finding a number of things with the system. One is that that the elitist system, tenants are applying online. They can make an account for themselves and they can put in their information. But a high percentage of those applications that are coming through are incomplete. Like the tenant may not know the information. They're sending through information that's incomplete. And this money, whereas the landlord compensation fund is being processed through local housing authorities,
right.
The ERAP program is being processed through local community action agencies. There's 18 community action agencies throughout the state of Oregon. And they are receiving those applications that flow through the state of Oregon. So, they open up their computer and they have these applications. What the folks at the community action agencies are finding is that they get incomplete applications, and they're spending a lot of time trying to track down data from tenants, trying to recontact them and complete the files so that they can work through them. And Historically, the community action agencies have had a very small flow of rental assistance through them, kind of a slow, steady flow. Right. And of course, with the federal funding that's come through, there's just an unprecedented flow of funding coming through right now. And I think, they really needed help from the state to staff up and to have be prepared for the volume of work that they would need to do. It was certainly foreseeable, and they have really. I've spoken personally with folks that work at community action agencies, and they're doing everything they can, and they really do provide a great service to their local communities. And I kind of feel for them, and that they've been burdened with a huge load of work, some of it coming to them incomplete.
Did Colorado have a different mechanism in getting funds out, or was it more? Was the state just better prepared to address this unprecedented amount of funds coming federally than the need to get those out?
Greg, that's an excellent question. I don't know the inner workings of how they put their system together. It did feel more streamlined,
right.
And I think that it does not appear that they put as many restrictions on the funding. The state of Oregon has put priorities on the funding, like priority of folks that make less than 50% over people who make less than 80%, the number of months that you've been unemployed, actually the area that you live in the state of Oregon. They're using a system,
like a scoring system
right. for that.
Which they talked about doing on the landlord compensation
mm-hmm.
fund at the beginning, but then when they didn't get the amount of applications, mm-hmm. yes.
It was some of those scoring systems that did slow the process down, though,
right.
With the landlord compensation, and I suspect with the ERAP program as well. And fundamentally, it's been one of our theses that if you want to build a program that prevents people from being evicted, why not make sure that your top priority is people who are about to be evicted? Right. So we've really, if the court system were to be open, and people who are unable to pay, if the regular filing process goes on as it typically would,
right.
And if a person comes to court and the landlord and the tenant are like, if not for the inability to pay, we would be fine. There's no need for legal fees or mediation or anything like that. Just give them the money. I mean, if we could create a higher priority for those who are economically burdened right now and get the rental assistance to them in an expeditious manner, we could, with the amount of funding that we have in the state of Oregon,
we could address a lot.
We could address it. I do believe that, and at the same time, people's situations are changing. There are a lot of folks that are going back to work. There are a lot of people who are going back to work but need that bridge from their first, second, and third paycheck to cover their rent. Right? They're trying to catch up. An injection of rental assistance could make all the difference in the world for them. Just getting on top of their personal bills. We see that a lot, and that's where a quicker deployment of the rental assistance could dramatically reduce housing insecurity in the state.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody about. It seemed as if our state was so concerned about who was getting the money as opposed to who would benefit from it. And I was talking to somebody because they were talking about the scoring system on the landlord compensation fund. And, I heard him say, we don't want money to go to owners of California. And I said, wait a minute, what is the concern where the money's going, or is the concern helping this tenant obligation? Let's get the money out, be it unemployment as well, get it to the people that need help. Yeah. Does it really matter who owns the building? It's the tenant that we're talking about. And I think there was a misconception of just kind of what the real it's almost like they lost what the intent was for these funds.
And that's Greg, it's interesting that part of the scoring, for example, on the landlord compensation had to do with the number of units that an owner owned. And when we broke down who was being most affected by the pandemic, we were looking at those naturally affordable Class C buildings that had as much, even as of last month, 15.5% of household unable to pay by the 15th of the month.
Right.
And the average size of those units were 75 units. So we were looking at when they built these, when they built the priority system, we're like, there's a very strong possibility that folks in this type of unit are going to be passed over. And still to this day, we're the most concerned about people living in those units. People in tax credit buildings will typically have a little more resident services, people who can help direct them to different sources of funding. Oftentimes managers who are more just keyed into the provision of residential services. But the conventional market rates
and private sector affordable housing, which is predominantly where most of the affordable housing is.
Yeah, and that's kind of our workforce too, and
right.
people who are the most deeply impacted by this, and doing outreach to them oftentimes comes through the site manager.
Yes,
and the challenges with some of the lawmaking is that the site manager began to shy away from asking people what their situation was, or to asking when they'll be able to pay, because of their fear of just the way the law was built around collections efforts. But it is the site manager. We've continually put out information that will help the site manager direct the tenants to available resources. Every time that we've heard of a new source, we've amplified it through our outreach.
But like you said, it's been tough for site managers because of some of the rules that are in place. Can you ask? Can you not ask? What does that lead you to? It's tough.
And Greg, outsized penalties for making a mistake. Outsized penalties are the other things that have kind of frozen people in place in terms, and it's broken down that relationship between the landlord and the tenant. It's not as, it's something that kind of needs to be rebuilt. And I talked to a lady yesterday who was in tears on the phone over not getting her landlord compensation fund, not being able to make the mortgage on a small 16-unit property that she owns and manages, and having tenants that are no longer kind of required to work with her.
Right.
And she had lost a lot of her mortgage payment on doing an eviction that she had to do for a person who was hurting other residents, right? So there are a lot of, I think, unintended consequences of the rulemaking that have really hampered the process of building healthy communities.
Well, we've talked about it. I mean, I think what's been happening the last number of years in this state is they've weaponized the relationship between the property owner and the tenant. When you're involved, there's usually a working together. Yes, there's some problem tenants. Yes, maybe there's some problem property owners. But at the end of the day, they are working together. There's no property owner that wants their unit vacant. And so there is a relationship there. And I think with some of the rules they put in place, they've made it very difficult to do that and continue that. The communication, it's been very tough. And so, my fear is you're going to have some of these smaller owners. And, I was talking to a lot of these smaller owners. They couldn't get through the landlord compensation fund. Yep. It was not, they don't have a management company that's doing it for them, and it was too much for them. And so you're going to have them. Are they going to step away and get out? And if I've talked to people, we're not heavily involved in single family at all, but talking to single family in the rental side, you see a lot of single family owners that are renting houses selling.
Yes.
They're not being bought by investors. It's being bought by owner occupied. So there's your larger 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom rental units available that are off market, which puts more pressure on demand.
And Greg, that is such an important point. I can't stress that enough. I'm hearing it consistently from the Oregon realtors. Like, their helpline is just bombarded with people who are wanting to sell their rentals. Right. And trying to understand what the regulations are around that now. And what people seem to forget is those single-family rentals work very well for families with children, large families with children, immigrant families with children, folks who are bringing in Section 8 vouchers for their families, where their family wouldn't fit into the regular 2-bedroom apartment on the second floor, and kids need a little bit of a yard to run around in, and those are drying up. at a rate that's just astounding. And that's a difficult number to get to, and we are doing some research on that right now. But, some of it is, I had people tell me that, if you're a small landlord, if you haven't sold already, you're kind of daydreaming about it right now. And the small landlord is extraordinarily nimble. I mean, right now the market prices for single-family homes are so attractive. Right. And then when you compare that with the current risks that they're faced with, and then, if you think that that's where their retirement savings might be, it's really not a hard decision to make right now. And I think we need to do more to retain those folks. Those are precious little assets that really do serve families with children.
Because you're not building 4-bedroom units on a new complex.
That's
That's just not happening.
Not happening.
So.
And then when those sell, it's a generational problem. Right. That unit, that house is not going to come back for another 20 years. It's going to be off the rental market for that period of time. So that we believe is a really serious problem.
So, well, thank you for taking the time to share this with us.
Greg, thank you so much for having me.
We'll be doing it again, and we'll see you next time on HFO-TV. Thank you.
Our entire office specializes in multifamily real estate, making HFO the largest multifamily brokerage in the Pacific Northwest. Your success is our passion. Build your legacy with HFO. Call 503-241-5541 or visit our website at hfore.com for more information.